Will you join me in welcoming Dr. Michael Henry?
All right. Thanks, guys. You ready to talk about some quantum physics tonight? Let's do it. All right. Cool. All right. Well, as Bob said, this is not a topic that I've spoken about a lot, but I am really thrilled and flattered to be here speaking to you guys. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Trinity Hall for hosting this, and thank you for listening. One of the things about science and faith that I've noticed in kind of preparing to talk tonight is that this topic tends to be sort of a debate format, and I think we'll kind of explore why that is maybe a little bit, but I'm going to be up here talking and trying to give you sort of a diverse set of views and trying to talk about different perspectives, not just one perspective, but I think the Q&A part of this could potentially be really interesting and lively, and I would love for you to heckle me with hard questions, and come up with some cool questions while I'm talking, write them down, whatever, and if one just strikes you, feel free to just holler out. I may or may not respond. So, going to be exploring the intersection of modern science, okay, and ancient religious faith, and so you can already see that there's a little bit of a contrast between these two perspectives. I'm a Christian. I grew up in Waco, Texas, and grew up going to a Methodist church, and so that's my particular faith. So I'm using the word faith sort of broadly. I think a lot of what I'm going to say tonight probably could apply to other faiths, other religious perspectives, but I guess I'm speaking from my own background as a Christian and a believer in the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament, if you will. So this broad realm of faith and science, I mean, it brings in so many topics, like major topics, like the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the nature of human consciousness, the purpose of life, the foundation of ethics and morals, the efficacy of prayer and meditation. I mean, these are huge, intimidating topics. And then, of course, there's a lot of areas of science that are implicated by this sort of discussion of science and faith. There's early universe cosmology, which is sort of a branch of physics, which is a little closer to my background. There's evolutionary biology, which is really not in the physics domain, so that's not an area that I have scientific expertise. There's geology and the study of fossil records. There's relativity, which is in the physics realm, psychology, brain science, neuroscience. So there's a ton that we could do here. There's a ton that you can do here as you explore this topic on your own. But I just want to kind of start off by maybe lowering the bar for myself a little bit, but also kind of easing the tension and say that I'm not gonna offer an answer to all these great mysteries. I mean, there's not a single resolution to what do we do with these huge topics. What I am going to talk about is sort of my experience as a person who has a faith in God, and my experience as a person who loves science and embraces science wholeheartedly and passionately, maybe, if I can geek out a little bit. But just to kind of, I guess, bring you the punchline up front, the topic is sort of, is there a conflict between science and faith? And I just want to say up front that you don't have to pick one or the other. You absolutely do not have to choose science as your worldview or religious faith as your worldview. And I don't think that anybody should tell you that you have to pick one. And hopefully some of the things I say tonight will kind of give you confidence in that as a conclusion, and maybe give you a little bit different perspective no matter where you're starting out. There is this sort of predominant view that you have to pick one, but there's a lot of scientists who do have a faith, a religious faith. There are many examples throughout history. So, I mean, you could start with Isaac Newton, who had a Christian faith. Does anyone know? We're going to sort of expose if there's any scientists or physicists. Does anyone know who Michael Faraday is? Okay, great. We're in good company. Okay, Michael Faraday was a devout Christian. He was an experimentalist. I was an experimental scientist. And so there's lots of other examples, but those are sort of historic examples. There's a lot of modern examples as well. I went to Baylor, as Bob said, and my professors in the physics department there at Baylor, they were Christians. I mean, one of them was a deacon at the local church and led a Bible study. One of them was a sort of a prominent speaker on the intersection of science and faith, and he had been one of the leading researchers in string theory at Caltech before he came to Baylor. So just sort of anecdotally, there are a lot of Christians who are prominent in their field of science and have been historically. But it is true that there are a lot of scientists, I think there are statistics that show that probably most scientists do claim an atheist worldview. And so I just want to kind of be upfront about that and honest about that if you encounter the world of science and if you encounter scientists just broadly, you're probably going to find a lot of either highly skeptical or agnostic or atheist worldviews. And I don't really think that proves anything necessarily. I think maybe it could be that people that come into the science profession maybe are more prone to be skeptical about certain things, more prone to see natural explanations for things. And I think also there's a culture in the science world, just like there's a culture in any profession. And maybe the culture, it's not cool to talk about your faith in science. I don't know. But the good news is that, and I do want to start with like something that I think everybody agrees on. Maybe not everybody, that could be an overstatement because everyone doesn't agree on anything. But I think everybody agrees that science does not prove or disprove the existence of God. It's not really the task of science to prove or disprove the existence of God. And I mean, even Richard Dawkins, if you've read much on this topic or have been exposed to this topic, if you've looked at his book, The God Delusion, one of his starting points is that we haven't proved or disproved the existence of God logically. And now he kind of brings it down to probabilities. Like we should weigh the evidence of whether or not God exists and look at probabilities. I think maybe a better perspective or a more practical perspective is to say, does religious faith offer us anything of value? And what does our religious faith offer us of value? What does science offer in terms of the value in our lives? And how much should we embrace science? How much should we embrace religious faith? And can we embrace them both? So I look at it from more of a practical perspective of value in our lives, in everyday application, as opposed to sort of turning it into a science problem of evaluating probabilities. So I want to kind of start off with talking about my background, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about science and maybe how there came to be this perception of a conflict. And then I want to talk about the value of faith in view of modern science, and then maybe go into some questions. So here's my history of how I came to be really excited about this topic. I was raised in two homes. I was fortunate enough to have two really loving parents who divorced when I was very young. And my mom and my dad, two very different people. Perhaps that's why they ended up in different homes. But they lived close to each other. I spent a lot of time with my mom, a lot of time with my dad. My mom was the type that she had me and my brother in church every Sunday that she could get us there, okay? We weren't just in church on Sunday morning. We were there on Sunday night and Wednesday night. We never went to a bar together for a church event like this, so maybe I need to talk to her about that. But I'm really thankful for that. I mean, I'm thankful for my mom having me in church and everything that I learned there. And my dad, we didn't go to church on the weekends when I was with my dad. And, I'm sure he had his reasons for that. But one of the things that my dad offered me was these deep, probing metaphysical questions about the nature of the universe. And he was really good at asking questions that didn't have answers, maybe just to annoy me. I don't know. But I can remember at a really early age my dad telling me that our solar system is just an atom in some larger universe or something, which is not true at all. I think he probably still believes that. But my dad definitely stimulated my interest in science. He wasn't a scientist, is not a scientist, but I think that the metaphysical intrigue and inquiry, the idea that the universe is a big mystery that we can explore and learn about, and continue to learn about in an academic sense, gave me this different perspective throughout my life, throughout my upbringing. So I kind of naturally had these two different lenses from my parents, from the different environments that I was around. And this kind of continued all through, high school, being at church type events and going to church camps and stuff. But also in high school, I had a great teacher at school who introduced me to quantum physics, and I was reading sort of pop science books on quantum physics. Has anyone ever heard of a book called The Dancing Woolley Masters? Okay. Oh, I got a hand. Yes. Okay. Don't read that book. Okay. It's not a good book on quantum physics. But it stimulated my interest. And then I went on to Baylor, as Bob said, and I majored in physics. And I loved quantum physics. Those were the courses that I was most intrigued by. And of course, I was also, the chaplain of the fraternity that I was in. So I continued to kind of hold on to both of these perspectives that I had. And then, as Bob said, I kind of hit the grad school lottery, and I got to go to MIT to do a PhD in nuclear science. I was elated. I was on cloud nine, and I loved it. It was a great experience. I still treasure those days and the time that I was there. But that was definitely a different environment than Waco, Texas, or Baylor University. Certainly science is the culture at MIT. You could call it like a temple of science and engineering. And as I mentioned before, scientists tend to be atheists, or at least that tends to be the worldview that gets talked about. And so just in that environment, for the first time, I really started to see the conflict, or at least I saw in my friends there that they perceived a real conflict. I can remember being at lunch with some of my close friends, and I was open about the fact that I was a Christian. It didn't really come up much, but they were kind of like, so how do you deal with the conflict, between Scripture and science? And I kind of was a little bit caught off guard. I was like, what conflict? I don't think there's a conflict. They're just two different sort of perspectives on the same thing. And they started to ask some more specific questions, and I realized that I wasn't really prepared to answer that. As much as I loved both, I guess I had never really explored the interface between them as much as I could have. And so that really motivated me to start looking into, is there a conflict? Can I really embrace both of these, or am I just fooling myself? And it was a long journey. I read a lot of books and, talked to a lot of people and made some friends in the process. But I think the culmination of that was a really cool experience I had the last year that I was at MIT. I was on a group, a committee, I guess, that hosted the first Veritas Forum at MIT. If you've ever heard of the Veritas Forum, I don't know if they have it at SMU. Maybe they do. But it's basically a series of events that are held on college campuses to sort of give an academic perspective or intellectual discussion around topics that are related to faith. And since this was the first Veritas Forum at MIT, we had it on science, faith, and technology. And one of the things that was really cool was that even though there weren't a lot of people talking about this just in day-to-day life on campus, we had a huge turnout. And we didn't just have a huge turnout. We had standing room only at certain events. And then this was the coolest part for me personally. So for some reason, I was tasked with marketing. I had no one at MIT knows anything about marketing. Well, they have a business school, the Sloan School. I'm sure there's some marketing people there. But no one on our committee. We were all science geeks. And so it was like, oh, this guy doesn't have anything to do. We'll make him the marketing guy. So I made these posters, and we put a lot of effort into these posters. Well, people spoofed our posters, which I thought was a huge compliment. Like we put up the posters all over campus that were like science, faith, and technology, and someone came along and made posters that looked exactly like ours, and they were like Satan, death, and technology, or something like that. I didn't really get it, but I was flattered, and it showed that people were engaged by this topic, even if it sort of upset some people or whatever. And so I guess what I came to realize is that the conflict is really about, and I mentioned this earlier, is really about whether religious faith has anything valuable to offer us. And I want to kind of give, just in the next part of the discussion here, kind of give an explanation of why a growing number of people maybe are saying no and citing science as a reason. I think the third part of the talk, I'll try to explain why I still hang on to faith, and I believe that it does offer something really valuable. But I think maybe a place to start for us is to see the perspective of someone who isn't like me, that grew up in a church and kind of has this tradition in their life. I guess I wanted to kind of introduce the conflict as more of a human conflict. It's not necessarily a logical conflict between what science is saying and what religious faith is saying per se. It's a conflict between people who think that there should be no more religious faith and people who value religious faith. And so I've got this book, The God Delusion, by Richard Dawkins. I don't know if you've ever read it. If you've ever had trouble understanding how someone could see science as presenting a conflict with religious ideas, you should read this, because it's kind of like a manifesto that a lot of people will cite. It's maybe 10 years old or so. But so Richard Dawkins here, this is page 5 of his book. He says, if this book works as I intend, religious leaders who open it will be atheists when they put it down. So that's a pretty bold statement. And he's sort of painting a broad brush with all religious readers, but I think it's interesting to see that there's maybe a specific type of religious reader that he has in mind. And this is on page 31. I mean, this is so hyperbolic, it's funny. He says, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. So yeah, I've always thought that was a pretty bold way to open a book of any sort. But I read that just to say, look, there is a conflict of people, and the people, I think, are going at it pretty hard, maybe, and so I think we should respond to those people. I think we should listen to those people, and I think that perhaps there's a conversation to be had. But it's also a relatively recent phenomenon, like in the sort of the global time scale of, like, this has emerged over the recent decades and maybe the recent centuries. So it's worth pointing out that, like, most of the major scientific breakthroughs and the dawn of the scientific method actually occurred in a heavily Judeo-Christian culture. Western Europe and later in the United States, but mostly in Western Europe. I mean, you had a Judeo-Christian culture that was heavily influenced by the church, and this is where a lot of the major breakthroughs of modern science occurred. And I'm not a historian, but there are plenty of historians who will point out that they believe that the Judeo-Christian worldview may have been one of the key ingredients that led to these discoveries. So that's not necessarily to prove that you have to have one to get the other, but I think it's a really strong argument that, in fact, the birthplace of modern science is in sort of the Judeo-Christian worldview, that there's a God who created the world. There's a God who gave us intellect to study the world. There's a God who created order and laws that we can understand and learn. And there's a beauty to it. And the world is good. The creation is good. And we should study it and learn about it. And there are a lot of people who have said, hey, look, if this view of God's creation as an orderly, good place that we can study and learn about, that's sort of a necessary ingredient to science, to at least the dawn of science, the modern science that we have now. Again, I don't think this really proves anything, but I think it's definitely worth noting that this is where science started, and the sort of divergence, if you will, between these worldviews sort of occurred in more recent times. So over the years, science became really powerful, and powerful in the sense that it predicted some like crazy things that you just couldn't have predicted otherwise, and they turned out to be true. I think general relativity and the bending of light around massive bodies in outer space is like just insane. Honestly, I have multiple physics degrees, and I can't really say that I fully understand general relativity. But quantum physics, which is sort of my world, predicts that things are fundamentally uncertain and random at some level of the universe, and that's just crazy. But it turns out to be the way that things actually behave. And if you don't embrace, none of us are out there doing these experiments, right? So it's not like the data is something that we're wowed by firsthand. But we all have like a phone in our pocket, right? We all have technology. We all have like LED lights. And if you use this technology, then you believe in the science, because none of this stuff would work if we didn't have relativity, quantum physics, and lots of other stuff. So science is powerful, and I think it became more and more powerful over time. And sort of another outcropping of science and modern science, beyond the predictions that it made and the technology that it produced, was some bold statements about the nature of reality, about the nature of our universe. And just to name a couple of big examples, like evolution, right? The idea that all of life evolved over millions of years from some common origin through this random process with natural selection. This was a bold statement, and it had big implications for what the Bible is telling us about the origin of life, and seems to conflict with some of the stories in the Bible. The Big Bang. This is another big one that, like we've got 7 days of creation, right? The Earth isn't, or the universe isn't 13.8 billion years old, but science is telling us that it is. And so I think, these bold statements that science was making about big topics sort of created this conflict, a perception that, whoa, science is maybe displacing some of religious domain, or is challenging long-held religious beliefs. And so I think this created a conflict, a dilemma for people, like a real dilemma for people who were conflicted between these crazy predictions and beliefs that have been treasured and valued and held on to. So without going into more detail about specific topics, Big Bang or evolution, I think that's beyond the scope of what I can get into with the time that we have. But I think a more meaningful point is that people have gone on to extrapolate this. It's like, oh, science has now explained the origin of life, the origin of the universe. Well, it can explain everything, right? So there was sort of an idea that science is just getting started, and that not only can science explain these few things, it can explain everything. And so people have taken this to kind of an ultimate degree of saying that, I think this is a relatively newer idea, this label of scientism, which is the idea that all valuable knowledge comes from the scientific method. Like if it doesn't come from the scientific method, worthless, which I think is kind of absurd, but actually if you kind of probe some people and ask and find out, they probably wouldn't label it scientism, but I think that if you have a real engaging conversation with some people, that they have sort of intuitively come to this belief just because of the science and the success and the authority that science has. And I think that's probably an overstatement. I love science as much as anybody, but I don't think there's any basis for saying that we need to reject all knowledge that isn't scientific knowledge. And then just briefly, in parallel with what's going on in science, there was maybe a realization within society that religion has done some bad things, right? I mean, I think we had a really good talk about that from Dr. Steve Danzy a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the church has not always done good, right? I mean, there's some bad things that the church has done, that religious people have done. And so I think that what you had, and I'm just sort of painting with broad strokes now, is sort of a growing sentiment that science is good and sufficient and powerful, and religion and faith is archaic, antiquated, and is useless. And I don't have lost my next brilliant thought, just fell on the floor. Okay, so that that's kind of the end of the second part of what I wanted to say, which is, hey, there is a conflict, and this is the nature of the conflict, and maybe this is the origin of the conflict, that science has developed this authority in the world, a de facto authority that maybe has displaced some of the authority that religious faith and religious groups had at one time. In my experience, faith, though, has been an extremely valuable component in my life in a number of different ways. And so I just want to say, we're left with this question, okay, what does faith have to offer? I started by saying that science hasn't disproven anything. It's really raised the question of what does faith have to offer? What does religion have to offer? What do religious texts have to offer us? And I just want to say a ton. Like, those of you in this room who do have a faith, who do believe in God, I mean, I hope that some of what I say here will resonate with you. If you don't, I would just encourage you to explore religious faith. I mean, to explore the Scripture, to read some of the books that talk about this intersection. But I just wanted to touch on three ways that religious faith has been valuable to me personally. Three valuable things that I think my faith has offered, sort of beyond science and beyond what science I think will ever do. And so just to kind of summarize, so I think religious faith gives us meaning and purpose that science doesn't. I think it gives us wisdom and tradition that science doesn't give us. And I think it describes a depth of human experience that science does not describe. So just to start with the first one, Christian faith is exploring a different type of question than science is exploring, okay? And I like this explanation. This isn't my own explanation, but I've heard it said many times that science and faith are they're providing different explanations for the same type of thing. So there can be two different explanations for the same event. If you ask, why is the water boiling? You could answer with thermodynamics, right? You could say that someone turned on the burner and it heated the water, and the water reached the boiling point, and the water vaporized, and the bubbles expanded and came up through the water, and that's why you get boiling. Another explanation is that I wanted a cup of tea, right? I mean, these are two valid explanations for the same thing. I don't drink tea, but I understand that people boil water when they want to have tea. I tried to think of like a whiskey analogy, but I think it would have been lost in the details. So faith explores purpose at a different level. I mean, I guess the meaning of it all, right? I mean, science can tell us a timeline of the universe. Great. I mean, I think science can tell us mechanisms for how things happened. Fantastic. But I don't know that it really gives us a sense of meaning. And I have found through my faith and through religious teaching and upbringing a huge sense of meaning. Another thing that I think remains valuable, or that I have found as valuable, is religious texts. So for me, that's the Bible, Old and New Testament, and religious institutions, the church. The Bible and the church provide wisdom and traditions that are never going to be provided by science, or at least at this point certainly are not. And I think just as some examples, if you've ever felt pain, if you've ever been at a point of suffering, the Psalms, I think, are a source of comfort. for a lot of us. That certainly there's not a science book that's going to echo the pain of losing someone or something else that we all have been through. I love reading prayers from church history, hymns. These are all sources of wisdom and truth that are not scientific, but they're real. The Sabbath, okay? I mean, what I think is really interesting, so I've held up the God delusion. I'm not going to hold it up again. There's a couple of other books that I wanted to mention, and at the end, please help me remember. I have some other resources that I want to tell you about, just because there's so many questions I'm not answering, and I'm going to let you do your homework or whatever. But there's so many things that, like religious traditions or practices, that science is now saying these things are really valuable and good for us. Surprise. And there's this book called Finding God in the Waves by a guy named Mike McHargue. He's also known as Science Mike. Okay. He's a little bit out there, okay, not a traditionalist by any sense, but this is a guy who was raised maybe a similar background to me, like sort of traditional Christian upbringing. He read the God delusion and lost his faith over time, but then he actually came back to I think the way he describes it, a deeper and more, I think, real religious faith through science, actually, and through realizing that some of the things like prayer, meditation, Sabbath, community, these things that church provides, that the church and Scripture have taught us, actually scientifically are valuable and good for us as human beings. And so I think I just want to say that the religious tradition and texts and institutions are really valuable. And even science, I think, itself has sort of shown us that. So a third, perhaps more important reason that faith has something valuable is it because it describes a depth of human experience. And I kind of touched on this earlier, but I think we all know intuitively that there's more to life than science has explained or described. I don't know, and maybe some of us don't know that intuitively, but from conversations, I think the majority of us do know that we felt joy and pain and love. We've witnessed suffering, growth, birth, death, injustice, benevolence. And we know that these things go deeper than what science is explaining. And I find all these things in the gospel message. Like I said, my tradition is the Christian tradition, and that's where I've found my faith in God, and that's where I've found meaning. And that's a product of my upbringing. But I think for me, the gospel message has been a source of endless insight and joy and wisdom and comfort and encouragement and transformation, and it's a continual process. But kind of putting all this together, my take on the gospel message is there's a God, a source of all life and beginning, in the beginning, the creator of everything. And this God who created everything, he loves us, and he believes that humanity is good, and that we each, all of us individually, have a capacity for good, and that he bears our pain and suffering, and he promises to heal the broken world around us. And this is a message that, to me, is more intriguing, more engaging, more compelling, more fascinating than anything that science has offered, as much of a science geek as I am. The story of Jesus' life, death, resurrection, I think it's a universal message. It's an announcement of a broad and subversive truth about the nature of reality and power and authority. And I think it's something that has continuing value for everybody, and we can embrace it wholeheartedly, while maintaining our love for science and embracing science knowledge and wisdom wholeheartedly, with intellect. So I think I've been told, is that kind of the end of my time? I'm going to wrap up here, and then we're going to have Q&A. So please bring your hard questions, and if I can't answer them, then I'll ignore them. All right, thank you. All right. Thank you. Awesome questions, guys. I'm overwhelmed and humored and intrigued. Anonymous questions are fun, aren't they? Okay, so where is your data that the scientific community is mainly atheist? Is that just an East Coast thing? I was born and raised in Waco, Texas, so I don't think anything that I'm saying up here is an East Coast thing. But I think that data about like the predominance of atheist worldview in the science community is in the God Delusion, the Dawkins book, the shiny one that I held up earlier. He has like a whole section on that, and interestingly, the book starts. I mean, it's a brilliant piece of persuasive writing. I mean, I'm an attorney now, so like I am really intrigued by the way that he crafts this argument. He starts by saying, "Oh yeah, Albert Einstein, the most prolific scientist that we all know." Well, he did talk a lot about God, but I'm going to define God as not the God that Albert Einstein talked about. So it makes it real handy to dismiss Einstein's belief when you define God as the thing that he didn't believe in. Anyway, so there's an answer to that question. My friend doesn't believe because of perceived conflict with science. What book do you recommend? I meant to recommend this book earlier. It's a book called Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles? It's by a guy named Ian Hutchinson. He just published this book a couple of years ago. He was the chairman of the department that I was in at MIT, and he's been speaking on this topic for a long time. He's spoken at lots of Veritas forums, and what he did is he took the questions that he's gotten at Veritas forum events and he compiled them and answered them all in a book. It's a really good book, and he's a legit scientist. He's a physical scientist, which is near and dear to my heart. Can a Scientist Believe in Miracles by Ian Hutchinson. An MIT professor answers questions on God and science. And believe me, he does it way better than I do. He's been doing it for a long time. Here's a couple of questions that go together, which I liked. I was going to list a few other resources, so I've told you about a few books. There's a podcast. I'm a big podcast geek. There's a podcast called Unbelievable. There's a guy named Justin Brierley. It's in the UK. But every week, it's a radio show on public radio, but it's reformatted as a podcast. And every week there's like a discussion, and he brings a person with a Christian viewpoint and then another viewpoint, often atheist, but sometimes just another faith or another worldview. And a lot of them are on science and faith. And so if you want to hear some really good debates that really explore some of this, go to the Unbelievable podcast. And then the Veritas Forum has a website where I think all of their old talks you can like YouTube them or whatever. So I would go to the Veritas Forum website. And then there's a guy named Francis Collins, who was the director of the Human Genome Project. He is a Christian, and he wrote a book. I'm drawing a blank now on the name of it. But Francis Collins, if you Google Francis Collins book, it's on Amazon. But it's really good. And he was one of our speakers at the Veritas Forum 10 years ago or whatever. And he's the one that gave me the idea to read that quote from the Dawkins book about the God of the Old Testament. That's how he started his presentation, and I thought it was really compelling. Okay, questions. You can't prove God. Why believe? Just fill in the gaps. And then a related question. In many evangelical circles where they try to embrace science, God ends up being God of the gaps. Explain why this is not a great position. So great, thank you. Because if I'd had more time, I would have definitely talked about this. So God of the gaps, if you aren't familiar with that, it basically says, everything that hasn't been explained by science yet, that's God, right? So there's a book called Darwin's Black Box that was popular maybe 15 years ago or something. And it was this idea that there's something called irreducible complexity and in biological systems that basically says that you could never, that evolution theory doesn't work, okay? That's kind of the bottom line of the book. And it was a pseudo-scientific explanation of the fact that evolution theory doesn't work because it doesn't explain certain things. Well, that's a God of the gaps theory. It says that, well, science hasn't explained this, and therefore that's what God did. And so I'm supposed to explain why this is not a great position. Well, if you imagine God as the thing that fills these gaps, and you realize that science is a growing, expanding body of knowledge, well, God starts to shrink, right? As we know more and more and more and learn and explain things, God gets smaller and smaller because the gaps get smaller. But also, I think it's that viewpoint discourages Christians from learning and exploring science. It's like if my faith in God depends on something not being explained by science, then of course I'm not going to legitimately or honestly explore or even consider explanations for that scientific phenomenon. So good question. God of the gaps, I think, is not a productive, or invoking God as an explanation for the things that science hasn't yet explained is not a really strong position for Christians to take. Okay, so how do you reconcile the contradictions between Scripture and well-tested scientific theories? For example, the discrepancy between the text of Genesis, which details the creation of the first humans, versus fossil evidence of proto-Homo sapiens. Related question, what would your response be to a person who insists that the heavens and earth were created in, quote, 7 days? How do you attempt to reconcile creation versus evolution? Does it give you any angst? Okay, so these are all related, and I actually love this topic, and actually had lots of notes that I was going to try to talk about it, but I realized that it's sort of a can of worms. But I think that the answer, to try to put it succinctly, is to embrace Scripture, but hold on to my interpretation of Scripture loosely, and let it be informed by other sources of knowledge. So, I mean, the 7 days of creation, we can just read the 7 days of creation, right? Like in the Bible. And I think the sun is created, anyone want to tell me which day? 4th. Nailed it. So the sun comes along on day 4, and we measure our days by the sun, right? So I think that there's like some hints within Genesis itself that maybe this isn't like really trying to describe 7 days on Earth. But this is a huge topic. And so there's a guy named Gordon Hugenberger, who is a pastor at Park Street Church in Boston, which that's the church that I went to when I lived up there. And he has a sermon, you could probably find it online, and it's like 10 different interpretations of the creation story. And I think there's probably others that he didn't talk about. But I think the point is that there are a lot of legitimate, intellectually sound ways of reading the creation story and interpreting it. And so I don't think that we should wed ourselves to a particular interpretation of it. And I think that if science is pointing us to one interpretation versus the other, maybe that could be helpful as to what the authors really meant, what God was really guiding people to say. And I think just to try to give a hint at that, it's like, so one of the ways that I have heard that really appeals to me to read the creation story is as a poem. It's a poem about the fact that there was a beginning and that God was that beginning. I think that in the ancient world, there were a lot of different gods, right? And there was a view that time was cyclical and that the universe was cyclical, or that the universe was eternal and never changed. And Genesis actually said there was a beginning, and that beginning was God. And it wasn't just any God. It wasn't your God or that God or whatever. It was the God of Abraham and Moses. It was this God. And I think that if we see that truth, I mean, that's actually sort of backed up by science, right? Like science didn't actually say that there was a beginning until, like, I don't know, about 100 years ago, when science started to say there was a Big Bang. Before that, I think that the predominant scientific view was that the universe was not expanding. It was sort of eternally a stagnant, steady state universe. And then science discovered, if you will, that the universe actually was expanding, and you could extrapolate that back to a singularity, which is the Big Bang. And I think that, in terms of evolution, I don't know. I really think that, like, the church, people of faith really could have embraced evolution early on as, like, showing that mankind, humans, were made from the earth, right? Like, we arose from the stuff that's the earth. I mean, that's like God, like, took some dirt and breathed into it, right, to create Adam and Eve. And God looked at his creation on the seventh day, and he said it's good, right? And I think that's what Genesis is. That's what I take from it. Not the only thing, but the creation story is that there's a beginning, and that beginning was God, something outside of our universe, and that God was pleased with his creation. And then Adam and Eve went and messed it up, right? Okay, so I'm afraid it does not give me angst to answer that question, but all right. What about Boltzmann grains? I don't know. What happened to the dinosaurs? I think it was a meteor, right? Okay, if creationists think the world is so young, how do you reconcile that with the geological record of millions of years old Earth? So I think I just kind of touched on that a little bit, but I think that maybe a broader perspective. So there's this other question: how have you responded to people who have claimed that science makes religious faith pointless, or that certain scientific understandings disprove religious beliefs? And my response to that, I think, is like that if you're going to embrace science, you have to be open to new information. Science is the process of science is an ever-changing and evolving one, and there's continually new discoveries, new information, and that's the beauty of it. And I personally think that the universe is this huge mystery that God gave us to explore and understand. And I think that's one of the privileges of being a human, privilege of being, a scientist when that was my field, and I still get to work with scientists and see what they're discovering. And so I think that my view, I'll speak personally, my view as a person of religious faith is that I need to be open to new information. I need to, and I don't want to say, I'm not saying that we should be flexible, because that kind of sounds like you should just have no backbone, right? You don't have any real beliefs. I think it's great to have strong beliefs. And I'll even say this, like, I think we should acknowledge that we do have strong beliefs, like we absolutely do. And I think we need to be sort of honest about that's a starting point. And then I think we also need to honestly be open to considering new information and listening to how our beliefs might grow and expand and become more nuanced and true and honest as we incorporate new knowledge from different fields, not just science, I mean history and lots of other things. So I don't know, I think maybe you could say that maybe a dynamic faith, or a dynamic the ability to grow with new information is to me has been the key to balancing these two things, the sort of logical conflicts, if you will. Let's see. Already answered those two. Do you use the Bible to interpret science, or science to interpret the Bible? That's a good question. I mean, thank you. So, I mean, this is just kind of gut reaction here. I've never gotten this question. I think it's a good one. I think that I probably tend to use science to interpret the Bible. And I think that maybe the reason for that is probably that the Bible is really hard to understand. It's ancient text. It was written by lots of different people over lots of different time and lots of different genres in the Bible, and it's a mystery. I think that the Bible is sort of a launching point for understanding and a launching point for discussion, and I think that we can use all types of different knowledge to understand what the Bible is telling us. I don't think that there's ever been a time that I used the Bible to interpret science, just speaking honestly. Let's see. Explain the quantum realm in Avengers Endgame. That's a good one. Let's see. Yeah. How do you view Scripture as part of your faith? Yeah, we've talked about that. But I mean, I want to also say in terms of Scripture, and I talked about this earlier, that I think not just Scripture, religious tradition, religious faith, it probes a different depth of the human experience, and so I don't turn to Scripture for scientific answers, but I turn to Scripture in times of anxiety. I mean, Jesus tells us, "Don't worry," and I think like. There's a sort of an anxiety culture in America today that's probably well documented. If there's another Q&A, someone would probably ask me where I got that. But I think that the message of Jesus that don't worry about tomorrow will worry about itself. I mean, that's just comforting to me. Come to me, all you who are weary and heavy laden, I will bring you rest. Take my yoke. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. I mean, this, to me, is just the ultimate comfort in times of stress and times of anxiety. I mean, I've been through tragedy in my life, just like probably everyone in here has. I've been through a lot of things. I've been through joy. I mean, I've got 2 sons that are, it's a miracle to see childbirth, to see something grow up and become a little human. Walking and talking, and just understanding the value of life, and understanding where life comes from and where the value and the beauty of it comes from. I mean, that's what Scripture does in my life. It doesn't explain how many days there were before the first humans, I think probably there's a much greater depth to Scripture than a lot of the things that have been maybe displaced by science. So I think that kind of wraps up the questions that we had. So that is the end of my presentation.
Thank you all very much for being here. Dr. Henry is going to stick around a little bit after the talk, and so if you want to just speak with him, then we encourage you to do so. We are very grateful that you've joined us, and we want you to know there is one more Pub Theology this summer. That's going to be next Monday night. George Mason, who's the senior pastor of Wilshire Baptist, is going to be here to talk about Christians and violence. And we would love to see you back here one more time this summer for our 2019 Pub Theology series. Thank you all for being here. See you next week.